Joining us now for our weekly market talk on the program is Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Michael, thanks for being with us again this week.
It's great to be back, Tyler.
Good to have you with us. Still plenty of a lot going on across the U.S. economy and certainly the world economy as well, Michael. And currently what's making quite a big impact in the United States, of course, has been the government's work to combat inflation. And so because of all that, certain economic issues or economic related issues that have maybe fallen to the wayside a little bit here in Michigan and across the union, including Congress working on a deal that will prevent a government shutdown. We've seen situations like this before that have come up, and usually these have been pretty big pieces of news, but kind of sneaking through the news cycle of late. Give us an update on that.
Yeah, ironically, we're in a situation right now where literally the government would run out of money on Friday to keep operating. And that's kind of a big deal considering how much of the U.S. economy is basically managed by the federal government. And actually, as it turned out, they were scheduled to run out of money last Friday, but they passed one of those short extensions of the budget for another week so they could try to resolve this by the end of the year. Now, this is quite controversial, given the fact that, of course, we know the Republicans are going to be taking over the House in the next Congress. So there was a big push among some Republicans to say, wait a minute, let's wait until next year so that we're able to have more power in negotiations. But it appears that the majority of senators did not agree with that. As we know, in the Senate, you need to get at least 60 votes to pass pretty much any kind of legislation. And there was a procedural vote yesterday that passed this legislation forward by a 70 to 25 vote margin. So it appears that there are the votes there to pass this legislation. Now, this legislation is what's called an omnibus bill. And these bills frequently include all kinds of different kinds of legislation, things that you wouldn't expect to see included in a budget bill. And that's certainly the case with this one. For example, this bill includes legislation that aims to address kind of the big issues that came up during the last presidential transition. We all remember what happened on January 6th and how there were certain efforts to kind of take advantage of some of the ambiguities in the law that dates back 135 years to try to kind of mess with the peaceful transition of power from one administration to the other. Well, there's legislation that was negotiated on a bipartisan basis that's included in this that addresses that. There's also legislation in there that bans TikTok on government devices, for example. But really, the biggest piece of this legislation has to do with the budget itself. And the big winner in the budget is going to be a big increase in defense spending. In fact, it's a bigger increase in defense spending than was asked for by the administration. So Republicans feel very good about this because they had frequently pushed for more defense spending. And in fact, in something that's a bit of a departure from the past, there's more spending on defense than there is in domestic programs, which is not typically how this proceeds. And I guess the way that a lot of people are justifying this is, of course, because of the fact that we've got the war going on in Ukraine. The United States is spending an enormous amount of money in Ukraine, and this budget includes extra funding for that. It also includes money to be able to essentially backfill the weapons that we've been sending over to Ukraine. We've been sending a lot of the weapons from our military over to Ukraine. And so what we've done now is included extra funding to be able to buy new weapons to kind of backfill what has been sent over there so that our military maintains its readiness. On the domestic spending front, there are a number of priorities that are addressed. For example, one thing that's nice is that they've made it easier for people to be able to save for retirement a little bit. There was a tax credit that was available to people who were in the lower income level trying to save for their retirement. That was only available, though, if they owed federal taxes. And they've changed that into an actual credit where they can kind of get money advanced to them. And it's advanced to them in the form of an investment directly in an account. So that's a positive. Generally speaking, I think that most people in Congress feel that this is an imperfect deal. Nobody got everything they wanted. But I think that everybody's generally relieved about the fact that there is going to be a continuation of the government. We're not going to see a shutdown anytime soon. Now, one issue that we have talked about in the past that I'm afraid to say is not addressed in this is the whole issue of the lending cap, basically the amounts that the federal government is able to borrow, the borrowing limit. That is not addressed here. And unfortunately, we're going to see efforts potentially next year by some members of Congress to try to play politics with this, which, as we've talked about before, is really something potentially very dangerous to our economy. So let's hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, we've seen political games be played on both sides of the aisle in the past for a number of issues that have led near
Yes.
or to a government shutdown, especially with everything going on in the economy right now. That government shutdown would have a much greater impact, I would believe, than ever before. Joining us on the Megacast is Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University School of Business Administration, with us on today's program, our weekly market talk with Michael Greiner. And Michael, similarly, from what we've been seeing earlier on in the pandemic, as things started opening back up, the flipping of the housing market, going from being more of a buyer's market to a seller's market, and back and forth and back and forth, all of that resulting now in housing prices continuing to experience a drop. And so with that comes fears of the last recession in the US and what was the final precursor for that, which was the housing crisis in 2008. How does this compare, these drops now, to the drops then? Should we be expecting, or could we potentially be expecting, a similar housing crash or near crash as we saw in 08?
Yes, and you're absolutely right, by the way, that this is directly related to efforts to fight inflation, because, of course, as we've talked about before, as the Fed has raised its interest rates, it's made mortgages more expensive for people, and that's where people start to get in trouble and aren't able to make their payments. I can certainly understand, by the way, how people are really worried about a repeat of the 2008 housing crisis. I was actually working as a bankruptcy attorney during that period, and I can tell you, I saw where people were struggling with being unable to keep their homes and the pain that it caused to so many people. And I can see where people be very worried about that. Fortunately, this is actually kind of a bit of a success story, I think, in the government response to that crisis, where there were additional efforts and controls put on the way that mortgages are originated to require people to have a little bit more equity in their homes before they're able to borrow mortgage funds. You see, the big problem that we had back in 2008 was that banks were lending up to the full value of what the house was worth, and maybe even beyond that. I remember during the lead up to that, there being loans for mortgages for 125% of the value of the home. And the problem with that is that they're basically counting on the value of the home continuing to go up. And if that stalls or goes down, then suddenly the equity is not there to be able to pay off the mortgages if there's a default. And that's where they start to run into problems. Well, as it turns out now, there's actually a really big cushion overall between the amount of equity that people have and the amount that they owe on their mortgages. And that equity is really going to be the key in people being able to avoid some kind of crisis like we had last time. And in fact, we saw the impact that it had during the COVID recession, where there were efforts to, for example, delay mortgage payments and that type of thing, or restructure mortgages for people who were out of work as a result of the COVID recession. And in those cases, those were possible because of the fact that people had that amount of equity there, where the banks felt that they were protected, even though they weren't necessarily getting the payments on a regular basis. And so I think there's a general agreement among most economists, myself included, that we're not likely to see another crisis like we saw back in 2008. And that's good news. And hopefully, this will help us really make this inflation fighting effort seem more like a bit of a soft landing rather than kind of the serious financial crisis that we had back then.
Another impact of inflation on the economy over the last 6 months to a year has been rising gas prices. Of late, these gas prices have continued to trickle downward, especially here in the state of Michigan. We've seen quite a drop, and we're at about near levels to a year ago, give or take about 10 to 15 cents, depending on where in Michigan you're at, over the past couple of weeks at the very least. But part of that may be due in part to the U.S. tapping into its strategic petroleum reserve. The Wall Street Journal this week posting an article about the U.S. having scored $4 billion of late on the sale of oil from strategic petroleum reserve. Just how much of that has had an impact on gas prices of late given inflation.
Yeah, this is kind of an interesting story as well, which is that I think there's general agreements that actually the administration tapping the strategic oil reserve that the United States established back over after the Arab oil embargo in the 70s probably had a positive impact on gas prices. You know, we had that big jump up in gas prices as a result of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. And that combined with the bouncing back of our economy from the COVID shutdown really made oil prices go very high. And we all remember the pain that that caused. And there was pretty severe criticism of the administration, actually, on tapping the strategic reserve at that time to release oil and basically push more oil into the market to affect that whole supply and demand dynamic and increase supply so the prices would go down a little bit. Well, as it turns out, when they started pushing out that oil, it was pushed out at a price of about $96 per barrel, which was pretty high. And people expected that it wasn't going to go much below that. Well, as it turns out, as we all know, the price of oil has been going down. And that has to do in large part, frankly, to the issues that China has been dealing with, where they've been demanding less oil than was previously expected, as well as the fact that Europe has moved very quickly to essentially reduce its reliance on Russian oil and to find alternate sources to address this, as well as the fact that there is also some additional production here in the United States. As a result of all that, now the prices of oil have dropped to, I believe around $74 a gallon. Well, that difference of $20 a gallon represents nearly $4 billion in profit that the federal government has made on the sale of those barrels of oil. And that's obviously critical, not just because of the fact that it's good for our budget, but also because of the fact that now we're going to be turning around and we're going to be working to refill the strategic petroleum reserve, make sure that there's plenty of oil in there in case another crisis comes up, that the federal government is able to release oil to affect the markets. And so as they're doing that, they're going to be able to refill it at a lower price than the price that was sold at, and thus the big really a profit for the federal government and something that we all should be thrilled about.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University on today's edition of the Megacast. You can learn more about educational opportunities and programs through the School of Business Administration at Oakland University by visiting oakland.edu. Michael, another couple minutes with you before we'll say goodbye today. Any other stories this week briefly that are making an impact or something we should be keeping an eye out for over the next couple weeks as we round out 2022?
Yeah, here's kind of an interesting story that I saw come across that is probably going to be of interest to many of our viewers here in Metro Detroit, and that's to do with Stellantis, which of course is the name now that is Chrysler and Jeep. And basically, what had happened is that Stellantis was trying to follow in the footsteps of GM, that made a huge investment in China and has been very successful over there. In fact, Buick vehicles are considered really one of the status symbols in China, and it's part of the reason why GM continued the Buick brand, even when it got rid of some of the other brands back in during the financial crisis in the mid 2000s. And as a result of that, there was hope, I think, by Jeep that they'd be able to start to invest in China and make some progress there, because China right now is about the biggest market for auto sales at all. And it's really one of the few growing markets for auto sales in the world. So it's a great opportunity for automakers, and one that I think Stellantis was hoping to take advantage of. Well, part of what they ran into is the problem that GM and VW and many other companies, not just in the auto industry, but for example, Boeing in the aircraft industry, have run into in doing business in China. And that is that China doesn't really respect property rights and intellectual property rights the way we do here in the United States and throughout the Western world. And so, what you see happening a lot of the time is that foreign companies like Stellantis, for example, will be forced into these joint partnerships with Chinese companies to do business in China. And that, in fact, happened with Stellantis, where they had a partner for manufacturing Jeeps in China. Well, as it turns out, they were unable to cooperate with their Chinese partner, and so as a result, have pulled out of that deal. Well, that leaves them without a way to manufacture vehicles in China, and we've seen now that VW, who's the market leader in China, as well as GM, who's in second place, have seen their market share declining as domestic competitors have been increasing. And many of these domestic competitors, frankly, have been created as a result of these joint venture relationships with these foreign companies. So it just shows really the challenges that American companies and European companies are dealing with as they're trying to do business with China. And really, it shows why there's some basis for the hawkish view that we're seeing in China, in Washington, I mean, in terms of American trade policies with China. And we've discussed that in the past. And I think we can only continue to see now that there's going to be more and more kind of decoupling between the United States economy and the Chinese economy as we recognize the fact, number one, that China hasn't really always played fair when it comes to its economic policies. And number two, that China is kind of feeling their oats right now. They feel that, oh, we've gotten what we need to from these foreign manufacturers, so we're going to kind of start pushing them out. And I think that what we're seeing going on with Stellantis right now is a harbinger of unfortunately things to come.
There will always be more to talk about in the near future with Michael about what's going on in U.S. economy. Still plenty of action and moving parts all across the U.S. and right here in the state of Michigan. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, and a happy holidays to you, to your crew, and all our viewers.